Washington, D.C., 1800. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of fresh-cut timber. Mosquitoes swarm above murky marshland as the sound of hammers echoes across a landscape more forest than city. This is Washington in the year 1800, America's brand new capital, a city that exists more as an idea than a reality. Wooden scaffolding clings to unfinished buildings rising from cleared patches of wilderness. Oxen pull carts loaded with sandstone blocks through rutted dirt roads that disappear into thick woods. We're about to walk through the federal city in its first year as the nation's capital, where President John Adams has just become the first leader to govern from this swampy stretch along the Potomac River. This is a pivotal moment in American history. The government has officially relocated from Philadelphia just months ago, bringing with it the grand ambitions of a young republic. But the reality on the ground is humbling. The city that Pierre L'Enfant envisioned as a magnificent capital of broad avenues and classical monuments is still mostly a blueprint. The population hovers around 8,000 souls, including nearly 3,000 enslaved people whose labor builds the very symbols of American democracy. The entire district covers 10 miles square, but most of it remains untouched wilderness. Two small settlements anchor this ambitious project: the new federal city proper and the established port town of Georgetown, a mile and a half to the northwest. The government chose this location as a compromise between North and South, placing the capital on the border between Maryland and Virginia. What makes this moment so crucial is the sheer audacity of it all. While European capitals have evolved over centuries, America is attempting to conjure a seat of power from almost nothing, in a location many consider inhospitable and impractical. Let's begin our journey at the heart of it all. The Capitol building rises from Jenkins Hill, though calling it a building is generous. Only the north wing approaches completion, a pale sandstone structure standing in stark isolation atop the ridge. Workers swarm the site, their shouts mixing with the rasp of saws and the crack of stone being split. The smell of mortar and fresh paint mingles with the earthy scent of exposed red clay. Stumps of recently felled trees dot the surrounding grounds. Scottish stonemasons shape blocks quarried from nearby Aquia Creek, while enslaved laborers haul materials and clear debris. The Senate chamber inside is nearly ready, but the House of Representatives will meet in a temporary structure for years to come. The hill offers a commanding view, exactly as L'Enfant intended. But in every direction you see forest, not city. A few scattered buildings cluster nearby, mostly boarding houses where congressmen will lodge during brief legislative sessions. Standing here, you can feel the weight of ambition pressing against the reality of mud and mosquitoes. This incomplete temple to democracy sits like a promise made, but not yet kept. The building's small size compared to what was planned reveals the gap between vision and reality. Yet even in its unfinished state, the Capitol makes a statement. This rough, improbable city aspires to something greater. From the Capitol, we trace the wide corridor of Pennsylvania Avenue westward. The name sounds grand, but the avenue itself is barely more than a crude path cut through the woods. Tree stumps remain in the roadway itself, making travel by carriage a bone-jarring experience. On rainy days, and there are many, the avenue becomes a river of mud so deep that horses can become mired. A few wooden structures line portions of the route, primitive taverns and boarding establishments with names like the Indian Queen and Rhodes Tavern. These rough buildings serve the small community of government workers, contractors, and speculators who've gambled their fortunes on this enterprise. The smell of wood smoke from their chimneys drifts across the clearing. At night, this path through the wilderness becomes genuinely dangerous, with no street lamps and thick forest pressing close on both sides. Travelers speak of encountering wild animals, and the isolation feels profound. Yet this muddy track connects the two most important buildings in America, and everyone who walks it understands they're traversing the symbolic heart of the nation. The avenue stretches for over a mile, and for most of that distance, you're surrounded by nothing but trees, and the occasional survey stake marking where streets will someday exist. Despite its crude state, Pennsylvania Avenue already hosts the human drama of the capital. Messengers rush back and forth carrying official correspondence. Land speculators walk its length, imagining fortunes. Women from nearby farms bring produce to sell to the government workers. This rough path is becoming the stage where American politics will play out for centuries to come. At the western end of Pennsylvania Avenue stands the President's House, though President Adams privately calls it a castle built for giants. The massive sandstone structure is even less finished than the Capitol. Paint is still wet in some rooms. Others lack plastered walls entirely. Abigail Adams, the First Lady, famously hangs the presidential laundry in the unfinished East Room because it's the only space large enough and dry enough. The building lacks basic amenities that even modest homes possess. There are no bells to summon servants, no proper staircases in the service areas, and the grounds remain a construction site with piles of stone and lumber scattered everywhere. Despite its incomplete state, the building's scale impresses. Irish architect James Hoban designed it to make a statement, and even half-finished, it succeeds. The columned north entrance promises elegance that the surrounding wilderness contradicts. A few outbuildings house the small staff, and wooden fences mark boundaries in the sea of construction. The smell of fresh plaster competes with the swampy odor from the nearby creek. At night, candlelight in the few occupied rooms makes the vast building seem even more isolated. This is where the President of the United States lives and works. Yet deer still graze on the front lawn, and the nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away. The symbolism is powerful, even if the reality is uncomfortable. This house represents permanence and authority in a city that feels temporary and uncertain. Beyond the immediate federal district, Georgetown thrives as a real, functioning community. Here, life feels more established and less experimental. 2- and 3-story brick buildings line the streets near the Potomac waterfront. The smell of tobacco warehouses mixes with salt air from the river. Georgetown has been a port town since before the Revolution, and it shows. Ships dock at wooden wharves, loading hogsheads of tobacco and barrels of flour bound for the Caribbean and Europe. Merchants in fine coats negotiate deals, while longshoremen in rough canvas clothes wrestle cargo. Taverns here serve actual meals and offer real beds, not the primitive accommodations of the federal city. The Georgetown market bustles with farm wives selling vegetables, bakers hawking fresh bread, and craftsmen displaying their wares. Stone warehouses store goods, and the town's mills grind grain from the surrounding Maryland countryside. The population here exceeds that of the new capital, and the residents view the federal experiment with a mixture of hope and skepticism. They've invested in the area's future, but they're not dependent on the government's whims. The contrast with the unfinished capital is striking. Here you find established businesses, completed buildings, actual street life. Yet Georgetown's role is already changing. It's no longer just a tobacco port. It's becoming the supply depot and social anchor for the struggling capital next door. The old families who've lived here for generations now host congressmen at dinner parties. Their elegant townhouses offer refuge from the primitive conditions down the river. Georgetown represents what Washington hopes to become: a real city with real economic purpose beyond politics. If you stand today at the Capitol, you won't see forest. You'll see a city of monuments and museums stretching in every direction. The building where only the North Wing existed in 1800 now sprawls across the hilltop, its famous dome visible from miles away. The muddy track of Pennsylvania Avenue became a grand boulevard lined with federal buildings, though even that has transformed multiple times over the centuries. The President's House that Abigail Adams found so uncomfortably large and unfinished is now one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth. Painted white for 2 centuries, surrounded by security barriers, and maintained by hundreds of staff. The mall that was swampland and pasture in 1800 is now a carefully manicured landscape of monuments and reflecting pools. Georgetown, which seemed so much more substantial than the federal city, was eventually absorbed into Washington itself, its old port warehouses converted into expensive shops and restaurants. If you could bring someone from 1800 forward in time, they might recognize the general layout, the grand avenues radiating from circles, because L'Enfant's plan did ultimately prevail. But the scale would astound them. The population that barely reached 8,000 now exceeds 700,000, with millions more in the surrounding suburbs. The forests are long gone, replaced by neighborhoods stretching for miles. Even the river has changed, its marshy edges hardened into seawalls and parkland. What this journey through 1800 Washington reveals is the extraordinary gap between intention and reality that defined America's early years. The founders built a capital in a swamp as an act of sheer will, believing that grand ideas could overcome practical obstacles. They were both right and wrong. The city did become the capital they envisioned, but it took decades longer than anyone imagined, and the journey was far messier than the elegant plans suggested. Standing in that muddy, unfinished city, you would have needed remarkable faith to see the future that eventually emerged. Yet that faith, that willingness to build something from nothing and call it the seat of power for a new kind of nation, captures something essential about the American experiment. The incomplete buildings, the rutted roads, the forest pressing close on every side, all of it testified to ambition larger than current capacity. And perhaps that's still true today, in different ways. The physical city has been realized beyond what Adams or L'Enfant could have imagined, but the work of democracy, like the Capitol in 1800, remains forever under construction. What city and year would you like to explore next? Drop your suggestion in the comments below.